The relentless imperial advance, coupled with the constant, insidious pressure of the demonic entities, ground the ghost eaters, kindred into the dust. Their numbers, once formidable, dwindled with terrifying speed, each skirmish claiming more lives, each passing hour eroding their sanity and their hope. The kindred was a broken thing, shattered by internal schisms, physically exhausted and mentally tormented. Yet, amidst the despair, a singular figure emerged, etched in suffering, but resolute, Shaper Kalar. He was no longer the cautious elder, the curious scholar of evolutionary adaptation. He was a warrior burdened by cosmic horror, a leader haunted by his choices and the sole anchor for his disintegrating people. Kalar's personal journey had become a crucible of agony. The Valar essence, deeply ingrained within his older, more powerful mind, had amplified his psychic abilities to unprecedented levels. He could perceive the battlefield with chilling clarity, seeing the intricate weave of imperial strategy, the panicked desperation of his own kindred, and the hungry, flickering presences of the demons. He could project his thoughts, not just to his fellow Kroot, but with a terrifying reach that brushed against the minds of the imperial psychers, a fleeting, raw spark of alien consciousness that caused them to flinch. He could feel the pain of every Kroot who fell, the cold, metallic efficiency of every imperial shot, and the gnawing, alien malice of every demon. But this power came at an unbearable cost. His body, once robust, was now a vessel of constant suffering. His quills, once green, now flickered with a sickly, unstable luminescence, a living conduit to the warp. His skin was mottled, crisscrossed with tiny, spider-web-like veins that pulsed with dark energy. His eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, burned with an unnatural, internal fire, reflecting the horrors he constantly perceived. His mind was a battleground, a ceaseless, roaring torrent of psychic static, demonic whispers, and imperial mental assaults. He slept rarely, and when he did, his dreams were nightmares of an encroaching, all-consuming void. He was slowly, inexorably being consumed by the very power he sought to control. Yet it was this suffering, this intimate connection to the warp, that forged his resolve. He understood, with a clarity that transcended mere Kroot intellect, the fundamental nature of their predicament. The Imperium sought to purge them. The demons sought to consume them. There was no escape, no surrender that would lead to anything but slow, agonizing dissection or eternal spiritual torment. His kindred, The Ghost Eaters were doomed. His focus narrowed to a singular, desperate objective: to deny both their tormentors. If they were to die, they would die on their own terms. If they were to be consumed, they would take as many as possible into the abyss with them. He saw the Imperial Psychers as the keystone of the Imperial assault. They were the shield against the demons, the precision weapon against his kindred. If they could be broken, then the Imperium would be exposed to the very horrors they sought to contain. And the Ghost Eaters might find a sliver of savage vengeance, a final act of defiance. He began to communicate with the few remaining mentally resilient Kroot. His voice, once a growl, was now a low, resonant hum, imbued with a subtle, psychic compulsion that bypassed their internal discord. He projected images of their fallen kin, of the encroaching demons, of the cold, unfeeling steel of the Imperial advance. He rekindled the ancestral pride, the fierce independence that defined the Kroot, twisting it into a desperate, apocalyptic resolve. He spoke of the great feast, not of flesh, but of souls, of consuming the essence of their enemies to fuel a final, devastating blow. Stalker Maw, though still haunted, had found a grim purpose in Kalar's unwavering resolve. His empathy, once a burden, became a finely tuned sensor for Imperial intent, for the subtle shifts in their battle plans, for the momentary lapses in their psychic shields. He became Kalar's shadow, his silent sentinel, relaying crucial information, anticipating threats, and guiding the few remaining effective Kroot warriors with unnerving precision. He hunted not for food, but for survival, his ancient rifle now feeling like an extension of his own desperate will. Gnarl Quill, reduced to a twitching, babbling mess, was too far gone for coherent action. But even his fractured mind held a terrible, volatile power. He was a living, screaming conduit to the warp, an unstable psychic bomb waiting for the right catalyst. Kalar watched him, a profound sorrow in his eyes, knowing that Gnarl Quill's fate would ultimately be intertwined with their desperate gambit. Kalar, the architect of their doom, was now the architect of their final, terrible defiance. He had embraced the monstrous truth of their transformation. He recognized the profound cosmic irony. The very powers that condemned them would be their only weapon. He prepared for the greatest hunt of all, not for prey, but for the very essence of their tormentors. His internal struggle was over. All that remained was the final, desperate act, a dance with damnation that would determine not only the fate of the Ghost Eaters, but perhaps, in a small, tragic way. The fate of Xylos Prime itself. The time for cunning had passed. The time for sacrifice, for a final, glorious consumption, had arrived. The Imperial forces, spearheaded by Inquisitor Vance's elite, sanctioned psychers, and the unwavering ranks of the Cadian 88th, pressed their assault with methodical brutality. Their objective was the Valar Cavern, the pulsating heart of the psychic anomaly, and the suspected last redoubt of the Ghost Eaters. The jungle around it had been reduced to a scorched, splintered ruin, the air thick with the acrid scent of ozone and promethium. Imperial vox casters blared litanies of purging, overwhelming the subtle whispers of the warp that still clung to the shattered landscape. But as the Imperials closed in, a chilling silence descended upon the Kroot lines. The frantic cries, the panicked chatter, the agonized psychic emanations of the kindred seemed to cease, replaced by an unnerving, focused stillness. Kalar, his form now a conduit of raw, uncontrolled psychic energy, stood at the vanguard of his remaining warriors, his eyes burning with an infernal light. He had made his decision. His strategy was a desperate, almost suicidal gamble, born of intimate knowledge of both the warp and the Kroot's own unique mutation. He aimed to turn the Imperial Psychers' greatest strength, their connection to the Immaterium, into their ultimate downfall. He understood that these Imperial Psychers, for all their training and their Emperor-given wards, were still human. Their minds, while disciplined, were not immune to the raw, untamed chaos of the warp, especially when bombarded by an alien, unstable psychic entity. The battle began with a wave of synchronized Kroot charges. These were not the disordered, desperate attacks of a broken foe, but a series of precision strikes, guided by Kalar's terrifyingly enhanced prescience. Stalker Maw, a blur of motion, led a small, fast-moving contingent of Kroot that bypassed the main Imperial lines, targeting the flanks where the sanctioned psychers were clustered, their psychic shields flaring around them. As the Kroot closed, Kalar unleashed his full psychic might. It was a raw, primal scream, an uncontrolled torrent of mental static, ancestral memories, and the Valar's dying agony, amplified by his direct connection to the warp. It wasn't an organized attack. It was a psychic overload, a direct, blunt force trauma to the minds of the Imperial Psychers. Their carefully constructed wards flickered and strained under the assault. The sanctioned Psychers, accustomed to precise, focused psychic duels, found their disciplined minds utterly overwhelmed by the chaotic, alien scream. Their senses were bombarded by images of impossible geometries, by the alien biology of the Kroot, by the terrifying, raw essence of the warp that Kalar had become. Some screamed, their eyes rolling back in their heads as blood streamed from their noses and ears. Others simply crumpled, their minds collapsing under the sheer, unfiltered onslaught. A few, the most powerful, attempted to retaliate, but their focused bolts of energy were fragmented and dissipated by the chaotic psychic field Kalar generated. As the Imperial psychic shield wavered, the waiting demons seized their opportunity. The air above the Kroot lines shimmered and tore open, not in small, localized incursions, but in wabbing rents that pulsed with sickly light. Greater demons, entities of immense power that had hitherto been repelled, now surged forth. A massive bloodthirster, a towering manifestation of cornate rage, roared as it materialized, its axe cleaving through a squad of Cadians before they could even scream. Horrors of Tzench cackled as they wove intricate patterns of warp fire, immolating entire platoons. Plague-bearers of Nurgle lumbered into the fray, their blighted weapons spreading contagion and decay. The Cadian 88th, for all their discipline, found themselves caught in an absolute nightmare. Their command structure, so reliant on the Psyker's battlefield intel and defensive wards, crumbled under the unexpected psychic assault and the sudden, overwhelming demonic onslaught. They were fighting on two fronts: the suicidal, psychically empowered Kroot, and the unending, impossible hordes of demons who reveled in the chaos. Imperial laser fire, once precise, now sprayed wildly, unable to differentiate between Xenos and daemons, or often caught in the crossfire of warp energy. Inquisitor Vance, witnessing the catastrophic unraveling of her carefully orchestrated assault, roared orders into her vox, but her voice was drowned out by the screams of the dying. Valerius, her chief interrogator and lead psyker, was among the first to fall, his mind dissolving into a screaming void as Kalar's psychic scream hit him directly. The remaining Imperial psykers, their mental barriers shattered, became vulnerable. Some, their minds now completely open, were possessed by the demons, their bodies twisting into grotesque parodies as they turned their psychic powers against their own comrades. Others simply burned out, their brains rupturing under the strain. Kalar, the epicenter of this psychic storm, felt his own body and mind tearing apart. He was a living conduit, and the raw power flowing through him was burning him alive. But he also felt a grim satisfaction. He saw the Imperial lines break, their discipline dissolving into panic. He saw the demons, the very creatures his kindred had suffered under, now turning on the Imperials with savage delight. He had achieved his purpose, to make them bleed, to make them understand the true cost of their intrusion. The ghost eaters, fighting with the feral desperation of cornered animals, found a fleeting, final surge of power in their collective agony. They charged into the breach, no longer focused on tactics, but on sheer, desperate attrition. Stalker Maw, his body riddled with las burns, brought down a lumbering plague-bearer with a well-aimed shot to its bloated head before falling to the claws of a bloodletter. Gnarl Quill, in his final, terrifying moments, erupted in a final, uncontrolled psychic blast that disintegrated a dozen demons and 3 Cadian troopers, leaving only a shimmering crater. The battle became a churning vortex of death, a maelstrom of psychic energy, imperial steel, and demonic fury. The imperial ground forces, now leaderless and exposed, fought a losing battle against the combined onslaught. Xylos Prime, once a verdant paradise, became a blazing crucible, its ancient trees immolated, its soil stained with the blood of Kroot, imperial, and demon alike. Kalar, his body alight with internal fire, his mind an echoing chamber of cosmic agony, knew his kindred was dying. But they would not go quietly. They would not be dissected. They would burn. And in their burning, they would consume, one last time, the essence of their enemies, fueling a final, desperate act of defiance that would echo through the warp itself. The battle for the Valar cavern had devolved into a maelstrom of unbridled chaos, a churning vortex where the material and immaterial, the sane and the utterly insane, clashed in a desperate death embrace. Imperial guard lines were shattered, their discipline undone by the horrific 3-way war. Demons, gorging on the psychic fallout and the raw emotions of fear and despair, flowed through the rifts like venom through veins, their numbers swelling with every fresh kill. And at the heart of it all, a blazing, sentient beacon of agony and defiance, stood Shaper Kalar. His body, now a living conduit of unstable warp energy, pulsed with sickening light. His quills, no longer merely flickering, now crackled with faint arcs of psychic lightning. His eyes, burning like twin embers, saw beyond the immediate chaos, into the deeper tapestry of the immaterium, perceiving the vast, hungry entities that watched their conflict like ghoulish connoisseurs. He felt the insidious tendrils of Theus powers trying to burrow into his mind, seeking to claim his powerful, suffering soul as their own. He was close to breaking, on the verge of becoming a gibbering mouthpiece for a demonic patron, a horrifying apotheosis of his kindred's accidental psychic awakening. But Kalar had seen the fate of his kindred. He had witnessed the slow descent into madness, the relentless butchery, the cold, clinical dissection that awaited any captured Kroot. He knew, with a terrible, absolute certainty, that there was no victory, no retreat, no redemption for the Ghost Eaters. Only sacrifice remained, drawing upon the fragments of ancestral knowledge, gleaned from generations of consumed minds, and illuminated by the raw, unfiltered insight granted by the Voilar essence. Kalar understood the true mechanism of their suffering. Their kindred had become a nexus, a powerful, open wound in reality, through which the warp bled into Xylos Prime. The only way to save what little remained, to sever the terrible connection, was to close that wound. And he, the primary conduit, the most potent psychic within the kindred, was the only one who could attempt it. He began the ritual, an act of desperate, suicidal devotion known only in the most ancient, forgotten annals of Kroot lore. It was not a ritual of summoning, but of containment. A desperate attempt to draw the raw, unthinking psychic energies into a singular focus, to become a void, a null point, a psychic black hole that would pull the encroaching warp back into itself, hopefully sealing the breach. He found a small, relatively intact outcropping of the Velar network, still pulsing with dim light amidst the wreckage. He plunged his hands deep into the crystalline roots, feeling the living currents of the Velar's dying thoughts. He closed his eyes, his mind focusing with a terrible, almost impossible singularity of purpose. He began to draw the ambient warp energy into himself, a suicidal act of psychic absorption. The daemons, perceiving this act of defiance, screamed in rage. They knew what he was attempting. They surged towards him, their forms twisting with hate, their claws extended, desperate to claim his powerful soul before he could deny them. Kalar felt their ravenous hunger, their malicious intent, but he did not falter. A few surviving Ghost Eaters, those not yet consumed by madness or death, understood his sacrifice. Stalker Ma, gravely wounded but still upright, bellowed a defiant challenge, drawing the attention of a pair of bloodletters away from his shaper. He fought with a ferocity that defied his injuries, buying Kalar precious seconds. Other Kroot, their eyes filled with a shared, desperate resolve, formed a ragged, defensive perimeter, their ancient rifles spitting fire, their quills bristling. They were few, and they were dying. But they were dying to protect their shaper's final, terrible act. Inquisitor Vance, witnessing Kalar's ritual from a distance, understood its implications. This was not a mere psyker unleashing a nova. This was a deliberate act of warp manipulation, a desperate attempt to sever a planetary connection to the immaterium. If he succeeded, Xylos Prime might be saved, but the sheer, uncontrolled release of energy could also tear the planet apart, or create a cataclysmic warp rift. More importantly, it denied her the opportunity to study the living source of the Kroot mutation. "Stop him!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse, pointing towards Kalar. "He cannot be allowed to sever the connection. Capture him. Alive." But it was too late. Kalar's body began to shimmer violently, his form blurring as he absorbed more and more raw warp energy. The air around him became superheated, crackling with unholy power. The ground buckled, and the very fabric of reality groaned under the strain. The demons recoiled, their forms flickering, caught in the terrifying vortex of energy Kalar was becoming. With a final, guttural scream, a silent, internal roar of defiance and agony, Kalar completed his sacrifice. His body imploded, not with a bang, but with a silent, inward collapse, a psychic implosion that created a temporary void. The massive, surging warp rifts around the cavern shuddered, convulsed, and then, with a sound like tearing silk, began to shrink, pulling the nearest demons back into the screaming depths of the immaterium. The ground ceased to tremble. The overwhelming psychic static in the air dulled, replaced by a profound, agonizing silence. The immediate area around the Valar cavern where Kalar had stood became a scorched, blackened circle of absolute nullity. Not a single trace of Kalar remained. No ash, no bone, no weapon. He had become a part of the void, a sacrifice to sever his kindred's cursed connection. The psychic shield was gone. The raw gateway was closed. The remaining Imperial Psykers, their minds still reeling, felt the immediate, profound relief, even as the chaos around them still raged. But the kindred was broken. Stalker Maw, witnessing his Shaper's final act, fell to his knees, his ancient rifle clattering to the ground. The sacrifice was complete, the connection severed. But the Ghost Eaters were utterly decimated, and their salvation had come at the highest possible price. The silence that followed Kalar's sacrifice was more profound than any roar of battle, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the ravaged landscape of Xylos Prime. The warp rifts, though diminished, still bled faintly, like festering wounds. But the raw, uncontrolled torrent of demonic incursions had ceased. The larger, more powerful demons, cut off from their primary conduit, shrieked in frustration as they were slowly, inexorably drawn back into the immaterium. But many lesser demons, gorged on the recent bloodshed and now localized, clung tenaciously to the material realm, scattering into the jungle's shadows, now fighting for their own survival against a newly revitalized imperial force. Inquisitor Vance, her face grim, but her eyes alight with cold fury, surveyed the aftermath. The Imperial Guard, though heavily battered and having taken grievous casualties, rallied. The immediate threat of psychic overload had dissipated, allowing their remaining sanctioned psychers to re-establish their wards and focus their efforts on the lingering, demonic presence. Squads of Cadians, their resolve hardened by the horrors they had witnessed, began systematically hunting down the scattered demons, their lasguns carving through the ethereal forms with renewed ferocity. The Ghost Eaters. Kindred, however, was shattered beyond repair. Only a handful of Kroot, perhaps a mere dozen, remained alive in the immediate vicinity of the Valar cavern. Stalker Maw, his body a map of fresh wounds, was one of them. He stared at the blackened circle where Kalar had made his sacrifice, his mind a void of grief and exhaustion. The psychic hum, the constant, agonizing static, was gone. His own psychic abilities, the precognitive flashes, the overwhelming empathy, had dulled to a faint echo, a phantom limb of a sense that was no longer there. He felt empty, disconnected. The remaining Ghost Eaters were a testament to their kindred's tragic fate. Many were shell-shocked, their minds irrevocably scarred by the warp's touch, even if the direct connection had been severed. Some sat weeping silently, their quills dulled and broken. Others simply stared ahead, their eyes empty, their spirits broken. The physical toll of the battle, combined with the psychic trauma, had reduced them to little more than wraiths of their former selves. Inquisitor Vance dispatched her Mechanicus Scitaria to secure the Valar cavern. The crystalline roots, once vibrant and pulsing, were now dark, brittle and lifeless. Kalar's sacrifice had not only severed the Kroot's connection, but had also utterly destroyed the Valar network itself, rendering the source of the anomaly inert. The Inquisitor felt a flicker of disappointment. Her prize, a living specimen of the psychic Kroot mutation, had eluded her. The opportunity for systematic dissection and study was gone. However, a new directive quickly superseded her initial goal. The handful of surviving Kroot were rounded up, not for immediate execution, but for capture and transport. Vance intended to take them to a heavily shielded research facility to dissect and examine every aspect of their biology, to understand how a Kroot could even possess a latent psychic gene, and how the Valar had activated it. She would not get her live, powerful psyker, but she would have their genetic remnants, their fragmented memories, their very cells. Their suffering, she decreed, would still serve the Imperium. The few remaining Ghost Eaters offered no resistance. They were too broken, too lost. Stalker Maw, his spirit heavy with the weight of his Shaper's sacrifice and the demise of his kindred, simply allowed himself to be bound, his eyes fixed on the distant, smoke-shrouded jungle. He knew that their journey was not over, only transformed. They were no longer the Ghost Eaters, masters of Xylos Prime, but mere remnants, trophies for a cold, unfeeling empire. Xylos Prime itself was purged. Vance deemed it too contaminated, too dangerous to leave to fester. Imperial extermination fleets were called in, orbital bombardments scourging the remaining jungle, burning away the demonic residue, vaporizing the last traces of the Valar network, and sterilizing the very soil. The verdant world, once a hidden paradise, became a charred, lifeless cinder, a monument to imperial ruthlessness and the tragic consequences of unintended warp contact. The kindred, what little remained of them, was loaded onto imperial transports, destined for a lifetime of incarceration and agonizing research. They were not glorious warriors, nor triumphant survivors. They were relics, living testaments to a terrible mistake, bound for laboratories and dissection tables, their minds forever haunted by the echoes of a power they could not control, and a sacrifice that had, in its own way, condemned them to a fate arguably worse than immediate death. The cost of their evolution had been everything, and the aftermath was utter crushing despair. The stars held no mercy for the Ghost Eaters. Their journey into the unknown depths of psychic power, born of curiosity and accelerated by their unique metabolism, had culminated not in dominion, but in a final, agonizing tragedy. Xylos Prime, their adopted home, was a scorched cinder, its memory erased from imperial charts. The Valar, the source of their unintended evolution, were utterly annihilated. And the Ghost Eaters, kindred itself, once a vibrant, adaptable people, was broken, scattered, and condemned. The few survivors, including the severely wounded Stalker Maw, were transported to a hidden Imperial research station deep within the Segmentum Pacificus, a grim, sterile facility known only as Xenobiological Enclave Delta 7. There, under the cold, unblinking gaze of Inquisitor Lyra Vance and her coterie of adeptus mechanicus xenobiologists. They endured a fate arguably worse than death. They were not simply executed. They were dissected. Not with knives, but with probes, scanners, and psychically active machinery. Their bodies, once proud and swift, were reduced to biological samples. Their quills, their skin, their very organs were meticulously catalogued, analyzed, and biopsied. Their minds, even in their broken state, were subjected to endless interrogations by specialized imperial psychers, seeking to extract every last fragment of information about the Velar essence, the nature of their warp sensitivity, and the mechanism of Kalar's sacrifice. Stalker Maw, his empathy a tortured echo, found his thoughts laid bare, his memories of Xylos Prime, of Kalar, of the orc Wag, and the demonic incursions, ruthlessly plundered. The shame and despair were absolute. None of the ghost eaters survived the ordeal for long. Their unique biology, once so adaptable, proved too fragile for the invasive imperial research. Their bodies, accustomed to a specific dietary regimen and rapid regeneration, withered in the sterile environment, unable to cope with the psychic probing and the constant trauma. One by one, they succumbed, their lives extinguished, not in battle, but on cold, steel tables. Their final moments filled with the silent hum of imperial machinery and the distant, unseen whispers of their captured minds. Stalker Maw was among the last to perish. His final breath, a silent growl of defiance, his mind finally finding peace in oblivion. Yet, a legacy, albeit a grim and unintended one, did persist. Inquisitor Vance, poring over the mountains of data, learned much from the Ghost Eater's sacrifice. She understood the profound danger of accidental warp mutation through Xenos consumption, and the insidious nature of latent psychic potential within adaptable species. Her findings would eventually be disseminated in highly classified, encrypted data packets, of course, across the Ordo Xenos, leading to new protocols for identifying and eradicating any similar emerging threats. The Ghost Eaters, in their unwitting doom, had become a cautionary tale for the Imperium, their very existence a blueprint for a new form of Xenos eradication. But in the wider galaxy, particularly amongst other Kroot kindreds, the story of the Ghost Eaters became a whispered legend, a fragmented warning. Nomad, Kroot, traversing the trade routes of the Tau Empire or the forgotten star lanes, would occasionally encounter tales of a kindred who had eaten the stars, who had acquired ghost sight, and who had ultimately been consumed by the very power they sought. The tale was often distorted, becoming a monstrous fable of a kindred that had gone too far, consumed something forbidden and invited a terrible doom upon themselves. It served as a grim reminder of the fine line between evolutionary adaptation and genetic damnation, a chilling lesson in the dangers of consuming the unknown. For the daemons, too, a memory lingered. The raw psychic energies of Kalar's sacrifice, the brief yet potent void he had created, had left an imprint on the immaterium. A faint, almost imperceptible scar in the warp remained, a reminder of the defiant Kroot Shaper who had, for a fleeting moment, successfully denied their insatiable hunger. Lingering entities, lesser demons, and warp predators would occasionally hunt the scattered remnants of Kroot migrating near the former coordinates of Xylos Prime, drawn by the residual psychic signature, forever seeking the taste of the unique, warp-sensitive prey that had once graced that now dead world. The Ghost Eater's kindred was no more. Their name, once a mark of their unique dietary habits, had become a tragic epitaph. They were a footnote in the endless war, a grim testament to the galaxy's indifference and its boundless cruelty. Their short, tragic existence was a stark reminder that in the 41st millennium, hope was an illusion, and every victory, even the victory of knowledge over ignorance, came at an unbearable, soul-crushing cost. The Ghost Eaters had consumed a gift, only to find it was a curse, dragging them and their entire kindred into the eternal night. Their legacy was one of hunger, not for power, but for a peace that would forever elude them, lost to the grim dark tapestry of an unforgiving universe.